Hello, and thank you for joining us on the Exploring Consciousness podcast. I'm your host, Donna Rebideau. Good morning, Exploring Consciousness podcast listeners. I'd like to welcome to the podcast today a scientist and pioneer, Dr. Jeffrey Mishlove. Welcome to the podcast, Jeffrey.
Thank you, Donna. I'm very happy to be with you.
I really appreciate the time. I know you're a busy guy. I appreciate it. Dr. Mishlove is a pioneer and a fighter. He holds the world's only doctoral diploma in parapsychology ever awarded by an accredited university, the University of California at Berkeley. The Association for Humanistic Psychology recognized Jeff's decades of passion for these fields when it presented him with the Pathfinder Award for his outstanding contributions to the exploration and expansion of human consciousness. Dr. Mishlove is author of The Roots of Consciousness, Psi Development Systems, and The PK Man. Between 1986 and 2002, he hosted and co-produced the original Thinking Aloud public television series. As a radio and television host, he has conducted over 1,000 interviews with researchers, thought leaders, and practitioners involved in parapsychology, consciousness, philosophy, spirituality, and related disciplines. What a great treat it is to have both a scientist and a pioneer in the field of consciousness. So again, I welcome you, Jeffrey, to the podcast. Since I have you here, I want people to understand that we have a pioneer. We have someone that broke down a lot of barriers, and with that comes a lot of angst. So today I would like to focus on Jeffrey, your vision, some pitfalls, advice, your current vision. So your original vision, your current vision. We're going to do some definitions and then get into some content. So I am very interested in your initial vision. We're talking about back in the 1977. And why did you choose to explore and become a PhD in parapsychology? Why not the traditional route of psychology?
Well, I was studying psychology. I had a bachelor's degree in psychology from the University of Wisconsin. I wrote a senior honors thesis on the psychology of religious mysticism. And when I started that project, I more or less assumed that I would be identifying various forms of psychopathology that allowed people to imagine they were having a variety of mystical experiences. But as I got into the literature, I discovered, amongst others, Abraham Maslow, who did studies of some of the most successful highly performing people of his era, people like Eleanor Roosevelt and Albert Einstein. And he discovered that they reported what he called peak experiences that were central to their personality and to their careers. And he realized what he was calling a peak experience was barely distinguishable at all from a mystical experience. So that gave me pause to reconsider things. Since then, I went on to get a master's degree in criminology at Berkeley. I was doing field work at San Quentin Prison in the psychiatric unit, doing psychotherapy with murderers and rapists. But at that point, I realized that my interest in human deviance was really toward the positive side of human deviance, not the negative. So I struggled and agonized about how you could make that switch, because at a great university like Berkeley, you could study psychopathology, sociopathology, and crime. There were many programs, but there were none focused on intuition, psychic functioning, mystical experience. And that's what I wanted to do. I agonized over this for months. And then I actually had a dream, and the dream really guided me to pursue the career that I've been doing getting a doctoral degree in parapsychology and doing interviews.
For 40 years, you've really followed up on that. Did you get any, what kind of pushback did you get? Did you, I mean, you had to put together a doctoral committee, but what were people saying at the time? Were they questioning, what you were going to do with this degree, or what happened there?
Well, I managed to create an individual degree using the interdisciplinary program at Berkeley, where if you're a graduate student in good standing, and if you can find 3 faculty members in different departments who will sponsor you, but no single department wants to take on your project, then you could do that at Berkeley in those days. But the closer I got to completing the degree, the more obstacles were thrown at me. And even after the degree was awarded, things really got bad, because at that point, the people who considered themselves skeptics, I think of them as pseudo-skeptics, but they launched a very underhanded effort to pressure the university to revoke my doctoral degree. And, they actually nearly succeeded in doing that.
And I want my listeners to understand what you went through. How, I started with you're a fighter, and a lot of my guests, they've had to persevere to get to this point. So when we say we're standing on the shoulders of giants, Jeffrey, I consider you a giant. I know you probably don't, but I want my listeners to look at you in that way. Can you talk a little bit about, there was a libel suit, right? What happened?
Well, as I say, the university nearly revoked my degree. The dean of the graduate division actually attempted to revoke my degree. And I went and spoke to somebody higher up, the provost at the university, who reversed that decision. But at the same time, the skeptics, including one of my disgruntled former faculty members, who had been, according to his own words, put on my committee as a, quote, hatchet man. This was a statistician who claimed that everything I did was totally incompetent, and so irredeemably incompetent that he felt no obligation to say why or to give any arguments at all. And this went on for years. I finally, protested to the university administration about it, and they issued a ruling saying that if he were to do that one more time, he would be removed from the committee. And he was removed from the committee when he did it, even though he had been under instructions from the graduate division at the university. So he then went and took all of his letters and statements claiming how incompetent I was, and passed them on to a group of professional skeptics, who passed them on to journalists, who wrote an article about me in Psychology Today, basically saying I probably didn't really get this degree, but if I did get it, I certainly didn't deserve it because my work was incompetent. So that's what led to a libel suit, which I had to fight for 6 years. At the end of 6 years, I did receive a favorable settlement. It wasn't a lot, but it enabled me to purchase some real estate in California back in the mid-1980s, which, because real estate appreciated enormously since then, has become, to a large extent, the basis of what little wealth I now enjoy.
Well, I love that story. I love that you persevered, and you really, as a pioneer, you knocked down the walls for all those people that are coming behind you, that are now able to study it scientifically. Now on the East Coast, J.B. Rhine was doing research, and he didn't run into the things that you ran into.
He had many problems.
He had problems, though, yeah.
He was viciously attacked by various skeptics to the point where he sought psychiatric counseling.
Did not know that.
To deal with that. And in fact, even while I was still in graduate school back in the 1970s, a very eminent physicist, John Wheeler, published an article, as I remember, in Science magazine, a major magazine, claiming that Rhine had engaged in fraud. And Wheeler, to his credit, ended up apologizing to Rhine because it was simply untrue. But that's the extent. You know, I have to tell you this, Donna. Everybody I know, without exception, in the field of parapsychology has their horror stories, because the skeptics are, within academia, they're very powerful, and they have a weapon, the horse laugh. So anybody who claims to have data of a parapsychological nature is typically accused of being a fool or a fraud.
But one of the reasons I'm fascinated with what you're doing, Jeffrey, is you're a scientist. You're the same person. You've gone through the same training. Had you continued in psychopathology with the San Quentin inmates, and it's the other side of the scale, you would have been, yeah, this is wonderful. It had nothing to do with your competence if you'd have done the negative. But by going and sliding that scale to the positive side, you're the same person, you have the same set of skills, but the content is what these people do. And let's spend a minute on skepticism. When I start the podcast, I interviewed Dr. Bill Bankston, and he gave a really nice overview of being an open skeptic. And again, he had a horror story. So there's something that you had to, that this group of people, your generation, my generation, we've had to break down these barriers to really call out these skeptics. They are the pseudoscientists. They are not looking at data. They're not looking at the science, correct?
Well, in general, that is correct. Of course, there are some exceptions.
Yes, yes.
But I think you have to appreciate it's a cultural thing. It's not so much that these skeptics are individually bad people.
Right, yeah.
They've bought into a widely accepted worldview known as materialism. And according to the materialistic worldview, these things are simply impossible, period. So it doesn't matter what evidence you have, because since they're impossible, you must be wrong. You know, the American Psychological Association is actually among the most hostile historically to parapsychology. Psychologists feel the most threatened because they're on the low end of the pecking order amongst the different scientific disciplines. And so they want to be accepted more, and the association with parapsychology troubles them. The last time before 2018 that they had published an article about parapsychology in their flagship journal, The American Psychologist, was about 30 years earlier. And it was a favorable article, and then nothing for 30 years. But in August of 2018, they did publish a massive study by Etzel Cardania, who was the editor at the time of the Journal of Parapsychology, reviewing what are known as meta-analyses, which are overall looking at a total of some 1,400 experiments in parapsychology that have been published in refereed scientific journals over the last more than a century. And the overwhelming statistical odds, when you combine all those studies, was astronomical in favor of the existence of parapsychological phenomenon. And the methodologies were good. As the methodologies got tighter and tighter, the results did not decline. So it's now on record in this very important journal of the American Psychological Association. So I would say it'll take decades for people to absorb these findings, but very, very slowly we are turning the corner.
And I was going to say, we've talked a little bit about the history and what you've had to go through, but it's now 40 years later, that's decades. And we are seeing the research out of the Rhine Center, the research out of Duke University, the some of the research coming out of Bigelow Institute and noetic studies, the one that Dr. Edgar Mitchell started, and Dean Radin, and Dr. Bengtson. So we're starting to see this finally, the breakdown of, you know, we've recorded this, we've measured it, here it is, here's our history, come take a look. And yeah, so I celebrate that. I thank you for that. I thank you for persevering, for being tough, for being a fighter, for getting here. I really do appreciate that. I do want to talk just a moment for my listeners that are the young people. I do have a group of young people that are listening in, and I thought it'd be great for you to give them some advice. If they wanted to start out, they're going to be starting out so different than how you started out. Is there any advice that you would give them in terms of what to look for in a program, or even what you found? Because it's such a wide area, is there a couple of areas that really do well for experimental research?
Well, you know, when I was a student, the standard advice was this, that you should get yourself well established in some conventional field before you begin to do anything related to parapsychology, so that you have job security. And most people follow that advice. I did not, and I have no regrets whatsoever. But in my case, to be honest, I have to call it an entrepreneurial spirit. My father was an independent businessman. I never really was looking forward to a career in some big institution where I'm part of a bureaucracy and a hierarchy. I've always really preferred to be independent. And so if you're the kind of person who feels, as I did, independent and entrepreneurial, I would say, you know, follow your passion and don't worry about the conventional advice. But if you're the sort of person who is looking forward to a safe and secure career of some sort, then yes, stay away from parapsychology at least until you already have tenure. I mean, for example, I've just now done a series of 4 interviews with Bernard Carr, professor of mathematics and astronomy at Queen Mary University of London. And he's now retired, and he's an emeritus professor. So he feels he can finally come out of the closet a little bit and talk about his real interests more publicly. It's interesting how emeritus professors are finally able to do that. And there are a number of them who have had, you know, lifelong interests in parapsychology, and they're talking about it. So which career path you choose is going to depend on your personality. And of course, even in the field of parapsychology, it touches on so many other areas of philosophy, psychotherapy, literature. There are many different ways you can approach it. Not everybody who has an interest in these things needs to or even wishes to have a degree in parapsychology. It's a very tiny field, really. And in the whole world, there are no more than about 400 people active in the field of parapsychology today.
No, that's great advice. And there's a couple of points that are very interesting. Dr. Bengtson gave the exact same advice. And he said it when he was giving another talk, and a young man ran up to him, and he was young, you know, and he said, "Oh, Dr. Bengtson," Dr. Bengtson was doing research on healing energy, and he was healing cancerous rats in the laboratory, and he's a sociologist. And a guy came up and said, "Oh, I want to do your work. I want to do your work. What's your best advice?" He goes, "Get tenure." You know, so it's, you know, it's very wise words. And by the way, I am a professor emeritus. So it's time that I came out and started, you know, telling people that in 1975, I applied for at the graduate school at Duke University at the J.B. Rhine Center. So my interest goes back as far as Jeffrey's, but my career took the safe path. So yeah, thank you so much for that. So is there anything, do you want to address any of what happened to you between having to rebuild your career and then you started the new Thinking Aloud? Is there anything in that period you'd like to share?
Well, to be fair, it was a difficult period in my life. I got trained in psychotherapy. I got credentialed as a licensed psychologist in the state of California. I started a business, in fact, a couple of different businesses. They were both failures ultimately, but you could say I learned about business the hard way. But maybe sometimes that's the best way to learn it, is through the school of hard knocks. I can look back now, decades later, and sort of laugh about it. But there were times when I really struggled. There were times, when it looked like the degree that I had been working on for 7 years at the University of California was about to be yanked away from me after I had already completed the whole program. That had an effect on my health. It wasn't good. So, there is often a price to be paid when you insist on, the way I like to put it is insist on becoming the best version of yourself. You're going to face obstacles, but those obstacles are often valuable teachers. So, and I think I had a lot of help. There were, as I say, I felt guided by dreams, and there were supportive people all along the way who helped me. And what I usually tell young people is this: if you resolve to become the best version of yourself, whatever that means for you, and it'll be different for everybody, the universe will reach out to help you.
That's perfect. Thank you, Jeffrey. Let's move the slider of your life away, toward the positive. I'm sure let's get away from your pain there, because you did turn it into a positive. And from 1986 to 2002, you hosted and co-produced original Thinking Aloud, public television. Can you talk about how that went and your vision there?
Well, it's actually quite interesting. I had a psychic friend, Carol Ann Dreyer. When I was doing my work in psychotherapy, I began doing hypnotic regressions with people. And Carol was like this psychic to the Hollywood stars. She was a good friend of mine. And she had a cable TV program in Los Angeles. And she flew me down to LA at her expense and interviewed me on her program. And then she said to me, Jeffrey, the reason I'm doing all this is because this is what you need to do. You go up to Northern California, you set up the studio just like I'm doing, work with a local cable station just like you saw me do, and I predict it's going to be successful beyond your wildest dreams. So that was a big impetus for me to launch. After my lawsuit against the university was finally settled, I launched the original Thinking Aloud television series on a local cable station. After we produced 10 programs, we took those tapes, videotapes, over to one of the local PBS stations in the San Francisco Bay Area. And they liked it, and they said, okay, we'll give you a primetime evening slot once a week. And after we did that for a year, they said, we'll sponsor you for satellite uplink to PBS stations all across North America, including in Canada. And so, within a few years, I found myself on 100 TV stations all across North America. Much more than I could have ever imagined when I first was interviewed by Carol Dreyer. So it's an example, another example of help, real serious help from a professional psychic.
Yeah, and it also is the price that you paid. There's also a good end of a story of the people, the pioneers, when they pay a price. there's also an outcome that the universe sees that, and here they embrace you and go, well, you know what, Jeffrey, we're gonna reward that. How did you get your guests? What kind of people were you able to start interviewing?
Well, you know, it wasn't difficult because,
Okay.
first of all, I'd been doing radio. You see, I didn't tell you this part of the story.
Yeah.
Back when I was still a graduate student in criminology in 1972, agonizing over how am I going to make this switch. I told you I had a dream.
Yeah.
And in the dream, I was visiting some friends of mine who lived in married student housing in Berkeley, way across town from me. I knocked on the door of their apartment, no answer. In the dream, I found a key, let myself into their apartment, walked into the living room, and there on the living room floor was a magazine called EYE. And I was paging through the magazine when I woke up with this feeling of exhilaration, like, wow, eureka, I have found it. And in fact, I actually, before I went to bed that night, after months of agonizing, I had this certainty, a feeling of knowing that I was going to find the answer in a dream and it was going to happen that night. So when I woke up in the morning, I didn't know what to make of it, you know. I'm so excited that I had this dream, but I didn't know what to do. So I put on my tennis shoes, ran 5 miles across town to this apartment, knocked on the door as I had dreamt. Nobody was home. And it so happened that I knew they kept a key under the doormat. So I found the key. I let myself in. I walked right into the living room. There in the middle of the living room floor was a magazine. The magazine was called Focus.
Unbelievable.
It literally brought focus to my life. If you have listeners in the San Francisco Bay Area, they'll know that that's the magazine of KQED, the public radio and TV station in San Francisco. And as I was paging through the magazine, it dawned on me, for the very first time in my life, I could pursue my interest by getting involved in the listener-sponsored nonprofit segment of the media, which was a huge shift for me then, because I was a long-haired hippie in those days. I did not own a radio or a television. In fact, I had an attitude about it. I thought that electronic communication was all phony baloney. The only authentic communication was face-to-face. And at that moment, I changed my mind. I went over to KPFA Radio, which was a listener-sponsored Pacifica radio station in Berkeley. And I said, I'm here to volunteer. And they said, well, good. Sit at this desk. And when you hear the doorbell ring, push this button and let people in the front door. That was my job. And even though I had at that point my master's degree, I gladly did it. And within 3 weeks, I had learned how to produce a radio program. I did a program, basically the theme was, you don't have to be from out of town to be psychic. I was interviewing local friends of mine in Berkeley talking about their psychic experiences. The program director liked it so much, he said, we have a regular slot every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon at noon called The Mind's Ear. And all of a sudden, I found myself sitting across a table with world-class experts who were on their book tours, coming to the San Francisco Bay Area, stopping in at KPFA Radio for an interview. And that, Donna, is what gave me the confidence to go back to the university and take advantage of the individual interdisciplinary doctoral program, because I knew at that point I had access to all of the leading experts in the field who had books coming out. I didn't have to rely on just, the professors at the university who, even though I found some very supportive and good professors, it wasn't, you know, like a whole department, but there at the radio station, I was able to, you know, interview world-class experts.
So this started with a dream, people. This was a dream. And I love how your dream really matched reality. What a great story. This podcast started with a dream.
Uh-huh. So
You
you
know?
had the same experience.
Yeah. And I had no idea. I had no idea.
Mm-hmm.
And it was like you said, to be open to it. And yeah, that's a great story. I love that story. So you're surprised at how the skills that you learned along the way has helped. And the skills that I learned as a college professor that I was teaching with technology are the skills I use in this podcast. So like you said, the universe does open its arms to you.
I started doing television. I'd already had many, many years as a radio interviewer.
Yeah.
Not to mention the fact that the Bay Area itself, in those days, I used to think of it as the capital of consciousness. Huge interest in the consciousness movement, in the human potential movement. The Bigelow Institute was there, many different Tibetan Buddhist centers, psychological groups such as you mentioned earlier, my involvement with the Association for Humanistic Psychology. Today, the Bay Area is an important intellectual center. These days, it's mostly associated with Silicon Valley and high tech, but there's always been a very strong interest in human potential in Northern California.
You end up there. That's just remarkable. So
I was at Berkeley.
When you're having your TV show, so you're able to have these guests, how did you go from television to now YouTube? And
well, we had a great run.
Yes, you did. Yeah.
Thinking Aloud series. We ran for 15 years, 1986 to 2002, and at that point, basically our funding ran out. And
okay.
So
I wondered. It was so successful.
Yes, it was, but you know, like almost 15 years is a very long time for a television show, and it took me from 2002 until 2015 to begin to launch the new Thinking Aloud YouTube channel. And by then, you know, technology had changed enormously.
So you have this interim time. Were you then teaching, and what were you doing in that time frame?
Yeah, I was doing a lot of things. I was teaching, I was lecturing. My wife and I had a consulting business. I was engaged in real estate speculation, working in the business world. I wrote a couple of books about financial forecasting. So, you know, I had a busy life, but come 2015, I saw the opportunity to set up my own video studio and launch a YouTube channel called New Thinking Aloud. And at that point, I guess I was looking at the original Thinking Aloud series that ran from 1986 to 2002. And my business partner then, Arthur Block, the author of the Murphy's Law series of comedy books, he had already established a YouTube channel. He was putting excerpts from the original Thinking Aloud series up on YouTube. And it was very popular. So I saw what could be done. And it was just a question of passion. I had an enormous passion to get this information out into the world. And I liked having an entrepreneurial spirit, the idea that I could have total control over it, and I wasn't dependent upon TV stations and program directors and et cetera, et cetera.
Is there anything else that you want to talk about this portion of your life?
On the original Thinking Aloud series, I had the great pleasure of interviewing Joseph Campbell. And I asked him, do you have any advice for the young people? And he said, yes. He said, follow your passion. And I think that was good advice. So I'm repeating it now for the benefit of your audience.
Today we're going to talk about your books. Especially I want to talk about the psi development systems, which is your basically, to set the record straight, is your doctoral dissertation. And then I want to talk about the roots of consciousness, because the show, Exploring Consciousness, we want to get your take on what is consciousness, and we're going to go into some definitions. So let's go ahead. As all good scientists, we like to start with definitions. What have you found? What is consciousness? How do you define consciousness?
I would say it's the simplest definition is probably the best. Consciousness is awareness. It's knowing that you know.
You know, most people know psychology, but if we give a definition of psychology and we give a definition of parapsychology, let's do that part.
Well, it's very interesting that psychology comes from the Greek word psyche, which means soul. So literally speaking, the word psychology means study of the soul. And the original founder of psychology in the United States, William James, viewed it that way. However, James died in 1910, and by 1920, the discipline of psychology became dominated by the behaviorist school. They insisted on calling themselves psychologists, but they didn't believe that you could study the soul. They felt that if you want to be scientific, you have to make it the study of behavior. And it got to the point where I was an undergraduate in the 1960s at the University of Wisconsin. The main activity of psychologists in the field of experimental psychology was running rats through mazes. That's what psychology had become. And at the same time, there was a rebirth, especially starting in the 1970s, of interest in the original thinking of William James, who wrote a fabulous essay called The Stream of Consciousness, where he's basically saying consciousness itself is the most direct experience that every person has. If you want to be scientific, start there. And there are people beginning in the 1970s began looking at things like biofeedback, altered states of consciousness through hypnosis and drugs, and meditation became an enormous interest. And of course, there was a revival of interest in parapsychology. The data of parapsychology is particularly important for the study of consciousness because of the very fact the reason the skeptics, the pseudo-skeptics I like to call them, are so upset about parapsychology is because you can't explain it in terms of materialistic metaphysics. And therefore they'd like to say, well, it doesn't exist. But here's the problem that they have. You can't explain normal consciousness with materialistic metaphysics either. What you end up with is what they call promissory materialism, that someday in the future, we will have a good materialistic explanation of normal consciousness. But the data of parapsychology suggests that the various metaphysical views of the world espoused in the world's great religious traditions, panpsychism or dualism or idealism, are probably more realistic descriptions of reality. Now, it may well be possible that a materialistic definition of reality can account for psychic phenomena. I don't want to rule it out, especially if we take into account the possibility of higher dimensions of space and time. But in any case, the data of parapsychology suggests that our 21st century view of the world, or maybe more accurately, 20th century view of the world, that consciousness is a byproduct of the activity of neurons in the brain, is simply unsatisfactory.
I was doing a biological psychology course, and we're looking at the brain, and you know, it's the 70s, and we're rebellious. And I'm turned to my professor and I said, well, we can, here's the limbic system, here's the hippocampus. Yeah. And he's going, yeah. I go, where's consciousness? And he goes, don't you dare. I said, well, how can you, no, really, I'm serious. Where is it? And I interviewed Tom Campbell and he said, we're talking about subjective versus objective. And so when you're looking at something, even Dr. Edgar Mitchell said, as an observer, even Einstein as an observer, you're the observer. How are you observing? How are you doing that? Through objective or subjective? I mean, I love that. That's a great answer. What else should we know? What other kind of definitions do people like to bandy about? So we know consciousness is awareness, the difference between psychology and parapsychology. There's a quote that you say, you want a society where we can cultivate our psi abilities like any other ability. I love that. And we're going to talk about that vision. But what is psi ability then?
Well, psi is an overall word used by parapsychologists for everything that they study. And it includes extrasensory perception, which can be broken down further into telepathy, clairvoyance, precognition, retrocognition. You could think of these as the passive forms of psychic awareness. And we could add to them clairaudience. And there's also the active form of psychic functioning, which is sometimes called telekinesis or psychokinesis. It could include metal bending. It might include psychic healing. It might even include telepathic transmission, sending your thoughts to another person. Those are the two main areas. But we have to say this, parapsychology evolved out of an earlier discipline, which was known as psychical research. And the pioneers of psychical research were looking at other questions like life after death and reincarnation. And parapsychologists today are in a kind of an awkward position because we're very interested in life after death and reincarnation, but we also realize that the very best evidence that we have these days for the possibility of the survival of human personality in the post-mortem state, that information could also be explained as extrasensory perception and psychokinesis. So that's why the word psi is kind of an overall term. In fact, we can't even clearly distinguish between psychokinesis and precognition. I did this 10-year study published in the book, The PK Man.
I was going to ask you about, can you talk about the PK Man? Perfect.
Well, he had enormous powers that he claimed he obtained by virtue of having a relationship with invisible hyperdimensional entities who existed on a giant UFO hovering over the planet. He called them the space intelligences. And he produced, I have in my files, 168 demonstrations of his powers. They would involve ending droughts, causing power blackouts, large scale, controlling hurricanes, causing UFO appearances, making lightning strike.
Is this Ted Owens?
His name is Ted Owens.
This is Ted Owens we're talking about.
Yes, and I studied him for 10 years. But the thing is this, when he says, for example, I am going to end the drought, and there's a serious drought, no end in sight, and he, for example, this happened in 1976 in California when there was a bad drought. He wrote a letter to my friends Hal Puthoff and Russell Targ, who were doing remote viewing research at SRI International in Menlo Park, California, where the drought was very serious. He said, I'm going to end that drought. He said, you'll know it was me because there will be every kind of funny weather, rain and sleet and hail and snow, and there will be UFO sightings, which is one of my trademarks. And within 3 days, your local newspaper is going to publish a story saying that the drought is over. Well, that happened. But the question is, did he predict it or did he cause it? And that's one of the reasons that parapsychologists prefer to use a word like psi, because we can't be sure. Russell Targ wrote him back a letter and saying that was a great prediction. And he responded to Russell Targ by saying, hell no, it was no prediction, I caused it.
But there's no proof. I mean, how do you prove that, Jeffrey?
That's the point. How do you?
Yeah. How do you prove that?
When somebody forecasts an event and the event happens, how do you know whether they caused it or predicted it? Now, you have to rely on what I would call the dramatic probabilities. For example, in one case, Ted Owens was working in a law office, and he was out in the stairwell of the office taking a little break, and a lawyer came out. It was a dark, the sky was cloudy, but it was not raining or storming. There was no lightning. And Ted Owens said to the lawyer, a man named Sidney Margulies, said, you know, I can make lightning strike. The lawyer said, oh yeah? Why don't you make lightning strike right over there by the Camden Bridge? And Ted Owens pointed his finger at the Camden Bridge. Within a minute, out of nowhere came a bolt of lightning that struck in that direction. There was no other lightning at the time. So the lawyer, Sidney Margulies, who I interviewed, actually wrote an affidavit, a notarized affidavit, attesting to what he had witnessed. Now, that to me seems pretty good as evidence of psychokinesis, because Ted Owens didn't make the prediction. Sidney Margulies said, why don't you make lightning strike over there? And then it happened. But perhaps Sidney Margulies was precognizing.
Interesting.
So you can never be 100% sure of the mechanisms of these things. We don't have a theory, an accepted theory of how all of this works. What we have is a lot of empirical data that these things happen. You could say this, as one of my professors, Michael Scriven, who was a philosopher, said, parapsychology is a field of science where you have a lot of data looking for a theory. Contrast that with psychoanalysis. The Freudian psychoanalysis, that's an academic discipline where you have a theory looking for data.
That is fantastic.
Yeah.
I love that. You know, let's talk about some of the stories. You worked with Uri Geller?
I sponsored Uri Geller's first major public appearance in the United States. It was in Zellerbach Auditorium at the University of California at Berkeley. We packed the auditorium, 1,800 people, and there was an overflow crowd. And so I got to watch him up close, you know, doing the spoon bending and other things that he did. He was a very good performer, and I'm convinced, after having watched him on numerous occasions, I can't say for sure that he never cheats. He, after all, was a stage performer. He probably learned some of those skills, but I can say with high confidence that there are instances in which he did things that I don't believe were the result of cheating.
Wow. That's why it's wonderful to have you as the scientist and your scientific mind to look at that. Did you work with, speaking of the SRI and some of the work that Hal Puthoff did you work with Pat Price? Did you see some of the work that he did, or Ingo Swann?
Well, I am well aware of that work, especially since Russell Targ came out with his video, Third Eye Spy, going into great detail about it. And I did do remote viewing at SRI on the very same occasion when they first introduced me to Ted Owens. So I had a successful remote viewing experience at SRI, but while I was there, this event that I told you about, ending the drought in 1976, had just occurred, and Puthoff and Targ were getting funding from the CIA, and they didn't want to have Ted Owens pestering them. He was saying, you know, you should be researching me. I'm the world's greatest psychic, not this Israeli Uri Geller. And they felt Uri Geller was too flamboyant for them. So they were so eager to have me take over the files on Ted Owens. They gave me all their files and said, you study him now. So they were able to, you know, just get that off of their plate, out of their bookshelf completely. And I took over that investigation.
Was it his personality? Was he as flamboyant as Uri? Is that why they didn't want him? I mean,
he liked to attract attention to himself, and he could be a difficult character. I introduced him to some of my friends. One of my friends, the psychologist Lee Poulos, described him as being like a grizzly bear with a burr up its ass. So he was.
Targ and Puthoff would not want to deal with that.
With a booming voice, and at one point we tried to get J. Allen Hynek interested in studying Ted Owens, and Hynek was, you know, one of the pioneer UFO researchers, because Owens was producing UFOs amongst other things. And Hynek said, I wouldn't go near him with a 10-foot pole because everything he does is a product of the unconscious mind, and I don't want to have anything to do with that.
And you had him for 10 years, Jeffrey?
I worked with him from 1976 until he died in 1987.
Yeah, PK man. Thank you. That's some information I did not know. So that leads us into remote viewing. And I know that you said you dabbled in it. What you thought was, with remote viewing, success was in the weekend courses that you called beginner's luck, but you went ahead and wanted to study it. You wanted to, you thought that that was a good topic for remote viewing because you have feedback. You can have evidence, you know, that, did you see that or didn't you? You know, and there's controls. The military did double blind, triple blind. They had really good controls. And I really liked what you were saying about you did the 8-week study and you saw beginner's luck, and then people got emotional and it went down, but then they kind of got okay with themselves and went back up, and thought it was a J curve, and it was important for the social environment and positive feedback. Can you talk about how you looked at RV as a science?
It's a complex field, I can say that. And what Puthoff and Targ at SRI had demonstrated was a remarkable track record. They had, you know, over 90% success in the many experiments that they published. Typically, what would happen for them is that government contract monitors, since they were being funded by the CIA and other military intelligence units, would come in, and the contract monitors were these skeptical people who couldn't believe what's going on at SRI. And Puthoff and Targ would say, well, the best way to demonstrate this to you is for you to be the subject. And they'd have them do the remote viewing, which really worked almost every time. That's how they managed to obtain continual funding from the US government for just about 20 years. Well, even after Puthoff and Targ retired from that work, it continued for 20 years. And with continuous funding, largely due to the fact that the contract monitors themselves, people with no interest in parapsychology, found that they could do this. But one of the things that you have to say about the work at SRI is, first of all of these individuals are successful professionals. Second of all, SRI is this big multi-million-dollar military industrial think tank. And you go in there and you see a lot of very expensive scientific equipment, a very beautiful cafeteria where you're fed and meet these people. And then you see these professional scientists who tell you very matter-of-factly, of course you can do this. Everybody here does this. So the whole ambiance is supportive. People who attempted to replicate that work in university settings, where instead of testing professionals who are successful and have self-confidence, you're testing college students who are very often a little bit insecure and don't have, the same kind of track record as successful professionals. So the work with college students was statistically significant above chance, but not at the 90% level that Puthoff and Tarr were achieving. So it's very useful to study why they did so well. But one of the things I found, I set up this 8-week training program. That was part of my dissertation work at Berkeley. One of the things that I discovered is that most people can do very well the first time. You can think of it as beginner's luck. You tell them, and they don't, people are sort of open-minded, they'll try it. And very often they got good, strong hits. And it happened with my group. I was working with volunteers. But then it starts to sink in. You begin to say, oh my gosh, what have I done? What are the implications of this? Am I going crazy? Am I psychic? And so your head starts spinning after a while with this information. And that causes a decline in scoring, because one of the factors that we know from many experiments in parapsychology is that a calm mind produces better results than an agitated mind. But, I mean, that was described in the Yoga Sutras many, many hundreds of years ago. So it took a while, I think, for people to, in my training program, we got this J-curve. They scored well, the scores dropped, but then they came back up over the 8 weeks. We tested them once a week for 8 weeks.
I would like you to write another book, Jeffrey. At 40 years, what you've seen, so you've been on this end of the slider, you've been on the positive end, and you've studied all this. When you look back, did you start in your mind, putting things in categories and saying, well, this is the part of psiability that I think might explain this, or this is the part that might explain that. Are you starting to see a theory? Do we have Jeffrey's theory of consciousness yet?
Well, no, I don't want to go that far.
Okay.
I'm not so much a theorist. I think if I get to categorize myself, I'm more like an encyclopedist. And my first book, The Roots of Consciousness, published in its second edition. It first came out in 1975, and then the second edition, it came out in 1993, as I recall. And that edition was called the Encyclopedia of Consciousness Studies. And even today, with the new Thinking Aloud video channel, it's like an encyclopedia. I think, this is an enormous field of study, even though it's almost entirely excluded from academia in the United States. If you want to become literate in this field, you need to be familiar with the siddhis as described in classical yoga, and the chakras, and kundalini, and witchcraft, and shamanism, and many, many popular approaches to enhancing consciousness, such as biofeedback, meditation, the relaxation response, not to mention all the experimental work, plus the work on reincarnation and life after death and altered states of consciousness. And psychedelics were an important part of my awakening as a college student in the 1960s. So all of this is relevant, plus work in quantum physics and philosophy and personality theory and psychology and the difference between traits and states. So I could go on and on about all of the nuances. And my goal now in putting all of this out on the new Thinking Aloud video channel on YouTube is to help create an awareness of the vastness of this field. There are many different angles of approach.
So in your Roots of Consciousness, in both those books, I was looking at the table of contents and I thought, I could talk to Jeffrey for 15 years because you are an encyclopedia. Do you feel like you're the halfway through what is really out there? Do you, like you're like wanting to mentor at this point? Hey, look at this encyclopedia.
Well, I tell you how I feel, Donna. I feel lonely.
Oh.
I've earned a doctoral degree in parapsychology 40 years ago. And I see that nobody subsequently has done it, and nor anybody before me. And so I'm kind of unique. And now, to be fair, there are hundreds of people who do doctoral dissertations on parapsychological topics and get degrees that have other designations like psychology or philosophy or education, even medicine. But the vision that I have is a little different, because a psychologist would view parapsychology as a branch of experimental psychology, where you have to know statistics and experimental design. But I think that's just one tiny part of what this field needs to be about. I'm glad I had a background in criminology, because the case study method of investigation, the way you might prepare a case to present to a jury in a courtroom, is also another very valid way of looking at this phenomenon, and certainly practicing the disciplines associated with psychic functioning, particularly meditation, getting involved in lucid dreaming, altered states of consciousness. All of that is relevant. So ultimately, what I would like to see are academic programs in this field that envision it the way I do, as a complete holistic field of study. And why I do the new Thinking Aloud video archive is because it's my belief that someday these programs will exist. There will be the demand for them publicly. The atmosphere will change. And at that point, the resource that I'm creating, this video archive, which now has, I don't know, 600,
I mean,
interviews with people working in the field or relevant areas adjacent to the field of parapsychology. It will be a resource for when that day comes about.
That's brilliant. And if you listen to Tom Campbell and some of his work, someone asked him the same question, and he said, when I talk about my theory, he's a theorist, so he's a physicist. And he said, I'm not talking to you. I'm talking to your grandchildren and their grandchildren. So I'm putting this down for posterity, for when the group will be ready. And that's what I feel about with you. I feel like by doing this recording, it's however, I'm in 71 countries. There will be 71 countries hearing this. And I'm hoping that these young people will pick up on this and go, oh, I want to take a look at that. And we'll create that young person to take your vision and to make it an academic program. I love that. Can you flesh that out any more than that? I mean, do you feel like between your books and your videos, how much more do you have? There's like another 20% we can go. There's so much more, Jeffrey.
Well, Socrates said the unexamined life is not worth living. And really, I think what this is all about, what drew me into the field in the first place, was the idea of self-knowledge. It's not as if there necessarily going to be careers out there, although there can be. People who go into parapsychology may work as teachers, they might work as consultants for business and industry, or law enforcement. They may work as psychotherapists. But my experience is that most of the people ultimately go into this field because they want to understand themselves. They want to know what does it mean to be conscious in the first place. If people are reporting these psychic experiences, is that something I should know about myself in that regard? The thing about going into a field for the purpose of self-knowledge is it may not pay the bills for everybody. That's why for many people it's important that they have some other means of supporting themselves. Some people will be successful supporting themselves in parapsychology, but it's usually a small number.
It's probably the remote viewers right now working with police, but even then it's still not a full-time job, is it?
Well, and not only that, they do that pro bono.
Yeah. So yeah.
You know, there are plenty of people who are earning livings as professional psychics, and I think many of them do good work.
Yeah.
But ultimately, the difference, you know, people go into the study of literature as a way to explore themselves for self-knowledge. People go into the field of philosophy for much the same reason. I think parapsychology is an excellent way to begin to acquire self-knowledge. It means, though, you want to be conversant with depth psychology, transpersonal psychology, with the world's spiritual traditions. You know, if anything, I'm advocating that people create a very large vocabulary for themselves in this area so that they're conversant with the many nuances. I think it's just an important thing for people to have that. Without that, I don't think you're a well-rounded, cosmopolitan individual.
So you're speaking to the choir. You know, I'm with you on that. And I would love to see, like you said, a college devoted to that, a department, a college. It really does. It needs to be a college. It's not just a department. It almost can be a university because you have the academic part, but then you have the part where you're talking about developing the ability, so the doing part. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit about where you talked about cultivating these abilities, as if like musical abilities, and I don't know, are you familiar with this school in England where they're teaching the children to go blindfold, and then are you familiar with that?
It was featured in a documentary created by Carolyn Corey called, I think, Supernormal was the name of it.
Yeah.
I know people in the parapsychology community who have looked at those videos of the children and they say, these kids are cheating.
Oh, are they? Okay.
So I don't know.
I don't have your school model. I liked that. That's what I see. I see an academic university of Mishlove.
A big community coming together of many people who are engaged in like-minded pursuits. You have an enormous expansion, for example, of Buddhism and Buddhist scholarship. You have the growth of people looking at dreams and the implications of dreaming and lucid dreams. You have hundreds, if not thousands, of research studies going on now in the area of meditation. You have a society looking at near-death experiences that didn't exist when I first started out in this field. You have transpersonal psychology and positive psychology, numerous television shows and ghost hunters. And so the community of interest is actually quite large.
So it's not so much going to be a college or a school. It's already happening. It's a collective consciousness starting to awaken on the planet.
I think that's probably the best way to look at it. And I've come to realize that my video channel, New Thinking Aloud, is really part of a much larger movement of awakening consciousness.
And very needed, because I don't, like you said, I don't think there's anybody like you that's done what you've done.
Not anybody exactly like me, but
Oh,
I want to mention that, there are hundreds of people
right,
working in parapsychology. It's
right.
also worth mentioning in the United Kingdom, they have now, I think, a couple of dozen professors at psychology departments across the United Kingdom who are doing research in parapsychology and related areas. But, there are many opportunities to study parapsychology in the United Kingdom.
Okay.
There are fewer opportunities to do it in the United States.
So it would really be more current for my listeners to probably do a Google search than put up an older, maybe not current list.
I imagine people
Yeah.
do their own internet research.
I wanted to ask you your most striking interview that struck you. I know you interviewed Joseph Campbell. Was there another interview that kind of made you stop in your tracks?
Well, there have been a number of them along the way. Usually the best interview is always the one I'm doing at the moment.
Yes.
But if I look back on it, I had a very profound interview with Rollo May, who was quite antagonistic
Oh my.
in a way, an existential psychologist who was hostile to the whole field of transpersonal psychology because he thought it was too religious, yet he himself had a strong interest in religious mysticism and, was a profound explorer of sort of the depths of the human heart and the darkness that sometimes people have to face. I've also had the privilege of interviewing Jean Houston, who has been a big inspiration to me, especially early in my career. I had a mentor, Arthur M. Young, who was the inventor of the Bell helicopter, a very wise man who wrote books on cosmology. It was a great privilege to be able to interview him. But, I could go on and on and on about the wonderful people I've had the good fortune to know.
And I didn't mean to put you on the spot and say, who's the one? It's just more like, just like, something that would have stopped you in your tracks. So on the same vein, is there one that was the most surprising? Was there one that you looked back on and went, oh, I didn't know that kind of opened up that door?
Well, not long ago, I did a couple of interviews with a psychologist from York University in Toronto, James Alcock, who was a well-known skeptic of parapsychology. And I thought we had a very friendly interview, good time together. I don't mind interviewing skeptics. If, for the most part, they don't want to talk to me, but I did very much enjoy the conversations I had with Alcock. We were able to agree on a great many things.
That's a great answer. So we've covered quite a bit, Jeffrey. How many times have you been interviewed?
Oh, several dozen.
Oh, you have? Okay.
I will say this, though, since you brought up your background as a professional athlete, I do remember that back in the days when I was a Berkeley student, I was invited to give a presentation to the swim team at Berkeley. They were, that year, back in the 1970s, they were the national championship team. And, or they were competing. They were getting ready and had a good chance of becoming the national championship team. So they wanted every edge, and they were very interested in, was there anything about parapsychology that might help them? And, I was happy to share the lesson for people, let's say, in a field like athletics. It's simply this, that the human mind is capable of doing things that other people will tell you are impossible. That's probably the main lesson. There are a lot of things that people will go around saying it can't happen, it's impossible, but it does happen. In fact, it happens pretty often.
That's interesting because, having been an athlete, but I also work with athletes. But I work with USA Bobsled and Skeleton and was on the World Cup with them. And I work with Major League Baseball. And what I find is the professional and elite athletes are very interested. They do want to know that, because at some point when you're at that level, everything that's physical, they're so well trained, highly competitive. So many things are equal. So the edge becomes the mind.
High performing people in athletics, in the arts, in music, in literature, in philosophy. I find that high performing people everywhere have kind of a natural feel for that there's something more out there, that the people who are typically the naysayers, the scoffers, the pseudo-skeptics, to me, they don't reach deep enough or see far enough.
What a great way to end that. I love that, because you're right. You took that slider and you put it over there, and you really were talking about high performance human beings. You're talking about the people that really want to stretch themselves. Jeffrey, I want to thank you for your performance, your high performance of being superhuman, and all the things you've gone through and all the things that you're giving us. And for wherever it's going to go, your work, your body of work has brought us as a consciousness so much forward. And I want to thank you for that. I know what you went through.
Thank you, Donna. My pleasure.
Thank you for listening to today's podcast. We publish our Exploring Consciousness podcast on the Monday, Wednesday, and Friday of the second week of every month. Please check the podcast schedule and more on our companion website, exploreconsciousness.com. Thank you again for listening.